Clara Whitmore threw the foreclosure notice into the fire and watched the flames curl around a signature that was not hers. She had 6 weeks to pay a debt she never signed for, or lose the only home her husband ever gave her. That same evening, a ragged stranger walked through her gate with cracked boots and empty hands, asking only for a place to sleep. She had no way of knowing the drifter standing in her doorway owned more land than the entire county, and that the ring hidden in his coat pocket would one day carry her name. Before we continue, if stories like this one move you, please subscribe to the channel and follow this story all the way to the end. Comment the city you're watching from. I love seeing how far this story travels, and knowing you're out there with me makes every word worth writing. The letter arrived on a Tuesday. Clara Whitmore did not open it right away. She already knew what it said. She had been dreading it for 3 months, ever since the bank in Denver stopped answering her letters and started sending men instead. This time the man was Elias Cobb, a land agent with soft hands and a voice like oiled leather. He did not get off his horse. He simply held the paper out toward her porch and waited for her to walk down and take it. "Mrs. Whitmore." "Mr. Cobb." "I trust you're keeping well." "I trust you didn't ride 2 hours to ask me that." Cobb smiled the way men smile when they already know they've won something. "There's a balance owed on this property, a note your husband signed before he passed. Interest has accumulated." Clara's hands were steady. Her voice was not. "My husband never took a loan against this land." "The bank has the documents." "Then the bank has documents I never saw." "That may be true, but the debt is real and the deadline is not negotiable. 6 weeks, Mrs. Whitmore. Pay the balance in full, or the property reverts to the bank." Clara looked down at the paper in her hands. $412. She had $11 in a tin box under her bed. "And if I can't—" Cobb's horse shifted beneath him, restless. "Then someone else will be standing on this porch come spring. Someone who can pay." He did not wait for her response. He turned his horse and rode back down the trail, and Clara stood there, with the paper shaking in her hands, though she told herself it was only the wind. She read the signature line twice. The handwriting was close to her husband's, close enough to fool a stranger, not close enough to fool her. "That's not his hand," she whispered to no one. "That's not his hand." But whispering it changed nothing. The bank had a paper. She had a memory. And in 6 weeks a memory would not be enough to keep a roof over her head. That night Clara sat at her kitchen table with a single candle and did the math 3 times, hoping the numbers would change. They didn't. She thought about selling the last of her cattle. $12, maybe $14 if the buyer was generous. She thought about the wedding ring she still wore, the one piece of gold she owned. Maybe $20 from a pawnbroker in town if she could bear to take it off. None of it added up to $412. None of it came close. She pressed her palms against her eyes and did not let herself cry, because crying had never once fixed a fence or paid a debt, and she had learned that lesson the hard way in the 2 years since her husband died. "I am not losing this place," she said out loud, to the empty kitchen, to the candle, to the ghost of a man who used to sit across from her at this very table. "I don't care what it takes." The candle burned down another inch before she finally blew it out. Jacob Pratt came calling 3 days later, and Clara knew before he opened his mouth that he had already heard about the debt. Everyone in the valley heard everything eventually. That was the curse of small places. Pratt owned the largest spread bordering hers, 4,000 acres to her 200, and he had made his interest in Clara plain since the week her husband was buried. Not interest in her exactly. Interest in her water rights and the creek that ran through her land and fed half the valley below it. He sat on her porch step without being invited and turned his hat over in his hands like a man rehearsing kindness he didn't feel. "Heard about your trouble with the bank." Word travels fast. "It's a small valley, Clara." She crossed her arms. "What do you want, Jacob? I want to help you." "You've never wanted to help me. You've wanted my creek since before Thomas was in the ground." Pratt had the decency to look almost embarrassed, though it didn't slow him down. I could pay off the note, all of it, today if you wanted. And in exchange, marry me. Combine the properties. You keep your house, I keep the cattle running, and neither of us has to worry about banks or agents or foreclosure ever again. Clara stared at him for a long moment, long enough that Pratt shifted uncomfortably on the step. You're offering to buy me Jacob, same as you'd buy a horse. I'm offering you security. There's a difference between security and a cage. I may be desperate, but I haven't gone blind. Pratt's jaw tightened. He put his hat back on and looked down at her with something colder than disappointment. You've got 6 weeks, Clara. Pride doesn't keep a roof over your head in January. When you change your mind, you know where to find me. I won't change my mind. Everyone changes their mind when the alternative is the road. He rode off without another word, and Clara stood on her porch, shaking with an anger she hadn't let herself feel in front of him, because she had learned that too, that men like Jacob Pratt fed on tears, and she would rather starve than feed him hers. The stranger arrived 2 days after that, just as the sun was dropping behind the ridge. Clara heard the horse before she saw the rider, and she was already at the door with her husband's old rifle in her hands by the time he came into view. He was thin, thinner than a man should be. His coat had been mended so many times it was more patch than coat, and his boots were cracked clean through at the toe. The horse beneath him looked almost as tired as he did, plodding slow and steady, like it had walked a very long way. That's far enough, Clara called out, rifle raised. The stranger stopped immediately, raised both hands slow and careful the way a man does when he's had a gun pointed at him before and knows exactly how these moments go wrong. I mean no harm, ma'am. Strangers rarely announce it when they do. Fair point. A pause. My name is Samuel Reed. I'm looking for work, any kind of work. I'll take a meal over wages if that's all you can spare. Clara studied him, studied the horse, the coat, the hollow look in his face that spoke of too many missed meals. This is a widow's ranch. I don't have money for hired hands. I didn't ask for money. Then what did you ask for? Work, a place to sleep, that's all. Clara kept the rifle steady, though something in her had already started to soften, and she hated that about herself. Hated how quickly her guard dropped for a tired stranger and a tired horse. Where are you from, Mr. Reed? Nowhere in particular. I've been moving through the territory a few months now. Running from something. Something flickered behind his eyes. Quick. Gone before she could name it. Everyone's running from something, ma'am. Clara lowered the rifle an inch, though she did not put it down entirely. I can't pay much, she said finally. The ranch barely survives on what it makes. I can offer you meals, a place to sleep in the barn, and whatever honest wages I can scrape together after that. Most men would have turned around right then. A ranch with no money and a widow with a rifle wasn't much of an offer. Samuel Reed simply nodded. That's enough. You haven't even asked what work needs doing. Doesn't matter. I'll do whatever you need. Clara lowered the rifle the rest of the way, though a small, careful part of her stayed alert, stayed watching. She had learned not to trust easily. She had learned that lesson from a piece of paper with a forged signature on it just days before. But there was something about the way this man stood, exhausted, hollowed out, and still standing straight, still meeting her eyes, instead of looking away, that made her set the rifle against the doorframe. Barn's that way, she said. There's hay enough for a bed if you don't mind sharing it with the horse. I don't mind. Supper's at 6. Don't be late. He was not. He tried to eat outside. Clara found him sitting on an overturned bucket near the barn door, a plate balanced on his knee, eating alone in the dark like it was the most natural thing in the world. Why are you sitting out here? Samuel looked up, startled. Didn't want to intrude, ma'am. Hired hands generally stay out of the house. Not at my table, they don't. I don't want to trouble you. You're not troubling me. You're confusing me. Get up and come inside before the food goes cold. He hesitated a moment longer than she expected. Something crossed his face, surprise maybe, or something closer to disbelief, before he stood and followed her in. He sat stiffly at first, like a man unused to being asked to sit anywhere at all, like a man who expected at any moment to be told he'd made a mistake and sent back outside. Clara noticed. She noticed most things. "You eat like you're waiting for someone to take the plate away from you," she said. Samuel's fork paused halfway to his mouth. "Old habit." "Whose habit?" "Mine." He didn't elaborate and Clara didn't push, though she filed the moment away the way she filed away most things she didn't yet understand. What Clara did not know, what she could not possibly have known, was that the man sitting across from her, eating a plate of beans and cornbread, like it was the finest meal he'd had in years, was not a wandering ranch hand at all. His name was not Samuel Reed, it was William Hawthorne, and William Hawthorne owned more land, more cattle, and more money than every ranch in the valley combined. 12,000 acres, 600 head of cattle, a mansion in the territorial capital with more rooms than he had ever bothered to count. He had left all of it behind 3 months ago, with nothing but a horse, an old coat, and a question he could no longer live without answering. Would anyone ever choose him, the man, not the money? 2 years earlier, a woman named Evelyn Carr had agreed to marry him. She'd worn his ring for 4 months before William overheard her laughing with her sister in a hallway saying she'd have married a toad if the toad owned 12,000 acres. He had not confronted her. He had simply quietly called off the wedding and told no one why. But the words stayed with him, burrowed into him, made him doubt every smile, every kindness, every woman who had ever looked at him like he mattered. He wanted more than he had ever wanted anything to know what it felt like to be wanted for nothing at all. And so he had ridden out of his own life with a false name and an old coat looking for someone who would treat a poor stranger like he was worth something. He had not expected to find her on a struggling widow's ranch with a rifle in her hands. But something about the way Clara Whitmore had stared him down, fierce and frightened and proud all at once, had told him this was exactly where he needed to be. "You're not eating," Clara said, pulling him back into the room. "Sorry, just thinking." "About what?" William Samuel looked at her for a long moment. "About how kind this is. The table, the food. Most people don't offer a stranger a seat." Clara shrugged, like it cost her nothing, though it cost her a great deal, feeding a mouth she could barely afford to feed. "No one eats alone at my table. Not while I've got a table to offer." Those simple words settled into William's chest like something warm and unfamiliar. The richest man in the territory had eaten more meals alone in his own mansion than he could count. Long tables, empty chairs, servants who spoke only when spoken to, and here in a house that might not belong to its owner come spring, a woman with almost nothing had made room for him without a second thought. He didn't know it yet, standing at the very beginning of this, but that single sentence would follow him for the rest of his life. "No one eats alone at my table." The days that followed fell into a rhythm neither of them expected. Samuel rose before dawn and worked until dark. He mended the fences that had been sagging since before Clara's husband died. He fixed the pump that had been groaning for 2 years. He rebuilt the porch step that had nearly broken Clara's ankle the previous winter. He did not complain. He did not ask for more than he was given. And slowly, carefully, Clara began to notice things about him that did not fit the story of a wandering drifter. The way he spoke when he forgot to guard his words carried an education most ranch hands didn't have. The way he handled tools, careful, precise, like a man who'd been taught rather than a man who'd learned by necessity. The way his eyes sometimes went distant and far away, like he was thinking of a life that had nothing to do with the one he was living now. "You're not what you say you are," Clara said one evening, watching him repair a hinge on the barn door. Samuel's hands stilled. "What do you mean?" "I mean, a ranch hand doesn't talk the way you talk. Doesn't hold a hammer the way you hold it. There's something you're not telling me, Samuel Reed." For a moment, William almost told her everything. The words rose in his throat, ready to spill out his real name, his real fortune, the real reason he'd shown up at her gate with nothing. But then he thought of Evelyn's laugh in that hallway. thought of every person who had ever smiled at him and meant his money instead. He swallowed the truth back down. "Everyone's got things they don't talk about," he said instead. "You never asked me why I was on the road in the first place." Clara held his gaze a moment longer, like she was deciding whether to push. She didn't. "Fair enough," she said. "Everyone's entitled to their own ghosts." But she watched him a little more closely after that, and William knew with a mixture of fear and something that felt dangerously close to hope that Clara Whitmore was not a woman who missed much. The trouble came from two directions at once, the way trouble in a small valley always seemed to. The first was Jacob Pratt. He rode out to Clara's ranch under the pretense of checking his fence line, though everyone including Clara knew his fence line ran nowhere near her property. He found Samuel repairing the corral and dismounted, slow, deliberate, sizing him up the way a man sizes up a rival. "You're the drifter Clara's taken in. Samuel Reed." He extended a hand. Pratt did not take it. "You know she's got 6 weeks before the bank takes this place out from under her." "I'm aware." "And what exactly do you think you're doing here, a man with no money, no name, anybody's heard of, sniffing around a woman who's about to lose everything she owns?" Samuel's jaw tightened, though his voice stayed level. "I'm working, that's all." "Working?" Pratt let the word sit in the air like something distasteful. "You've got nothing to offer her, Reed. No land, no money, no future. When this ranch is gone, what exactly do you plan to do? Ride off into the sunset together penniless?" "That's between me and Mrs. Whitmore. It's between you and me if you're standing on land I intend to own." Pratt's voice dropped low, dangerous. "I'd think hard about how long you plan on staying, drifter. Men without roots have a way of disappearing quietly. I'd hate for that to happen to you the hard way." Samuel did not flinch. "Is that a threat, Mr. Pratt?" "It's advice. Take it or don't." Pratt rode off, and Samuel stood there a long moment, hands curling into fists at his sides, fighting the urge to do something he could not take back. Fighting the urge to tell this man exactly who he was dealing with, that he could buy Pratt's entire spread twice over, without blinking that the word penniless had never once applied to him in his life. But that would end everything. That would prove Clara had been right to wonder, and it would prove to himself that the only reason anyone respected him was the money in his name. He said nothing. He went back to the corral and kept working, and if his hands shook a little as he drove the next nail, he told himself it was only the cold. Oh. The second trouble arrived 3 days later in the form of Elias Cobb back on Clara's porch, with a tighter deadline and a colder smile. "There's been a development, Mrs. Whitmore." Clara felt her stomach drop. "What kind of development?" "The bank has decided your circumstances warrant expedited resolution. Rather than 6 weeks, you now have 3. "That's not what the paper said." "The paper can be amended. Banks amend things all the time." Clara stared at him, and for the first time since this whole ordeal began, real panic crept into her voice. 3 weeks. I can barely raise the money in 6, let alone 3. That's an unfortunate position to be in. You're doing this on purpose. Cobb's expression didn't change, though something behind his eyes flickered something that told Clara in that instant that she was right. "I'm simply relaying the bank's decision, Mrs. Whitmore. Nothing more." He rode away before she could say another word, and Clara stood on her porch with her hands shaking, staring after him. Samuel came around the side of the barn just as Cobb disappeared down the trail, and he found Clara sitting hard on the porch steps, her face white. "Clara." 3 weeks, she said barely above a whisper. "He's cut it to 3 weeks." Samuel sat beside her close, but not touching the way a careful man sits beside a woman who is trying very hard not to fall apart. "That's not right. That's not how these things work." "You know how banks work, do you?" Her voice cracked with something between grief and bitter laughter. Samuel caught himself. "I've heard things. On the road. Men talk." Clara pressed the heels of her hands against her eyes. "I don't understand why they want this land so badly. It's 200 acres and a house that's falling apart at the seams. Why would a bank move heaven and earth over a debt that isn't even mine?" William's mind moved fast, turning the pieces over. A forged signature. An expedited deadline. A wealthy neighbor circling like a vulture offering to solve everything if she'd only marry him. It did not take a genius to see the shape of what was happening here. But he could not tell her what he suspected. Not without revealing how he knew, not without unraveling everything. "I don't know," he said instead. And it was the first outright lie he'd told her, and it sat in his stomach like a stone. "But I know you're not facing it alone. Not while I'm here." Clara looked over at him, eyes red-rimmed but steady. "You're a ranch hand with a horse and a coat full of holes, Samuel. There's not much you can do against a bank." "Maybe not," he said quietly. "But I can do more than nothing." He meant it more than she could possibly understand. That night, after Clara had gone to bed, William sat alone in the barn, with a stub of pencil and a scrap of paper doing sums by lantern light. He had access to 12,000 acres and more money than this entire valley had seen in a decade, and none of it was any use to him here disguised as a penniless drifter, because the moment he produced $400, every question Clara had ever asked about him would demand an answer he wasn't ready to give. But there were other ways to help, quieter ways. He thought about the letter he could write to his lawyer in the capital, a careful anonymous inquiry into a land transaction in this valley, a debt that smelled wrong from every angle he examined it. He thought about the small gold pocket watch still hidden in the lining of his coat, the one thing of value he'd kept from his old life. It wasn't $400, but it was something. He folded the paper, tucked it away, and lay back in the hay, staring up at the barn roof, listening to his own horse breathing steady in the dark. "I didn't come here for this," he murmured to no one. "I came here to find out if she'd choose me with nothing." But somewhere in the last 2 weeks, the question had changed shape. It was no longer only about himself. It had become about her, about keeping this place standing, about the fierce, proud, exhausted woman who had put a plate in front of a stranger and said without hesitation, "No one eats alone at my table." He closed his eyes, and for the first time since Evelyn's laughter had chased him out of his own life, William Hawthorne felt something that wasn't loneliness. He was terrified of what that meant. Clara found him the next evening sitting on the porch step, turning something small and gold over in his fingers, quickly closing his fist around it when he heard her footsteps. "What's that?" "Nothing." "Samuel." He hesitated, then opened his hand. A pocket watch worn, but clearly once expensive, the kind of thing that did not belong in the pocket of a penniless drifter. Clara's eyes narrowed. "That's a fine watch for a man with holes in his boots." "It was my father's," Samuel said, and this part at least was true. "It's the only thing of his I kept." Something in his voice, raw, unguarded, stopped Clara's suspicion cold. She had heard that particular note before in her own voice talking about her husband. "You don't talk about your family much." "There's not much left to talk about." Clara sat down beside him on the step closer than she'd meant to. "My husband died 2 years ago," she said quietly. "Fever took him in a single week. One day he was strong as an ox laughing at supper, and 6 days later I was standing over a grave I dug myself because I couldn't afford to pay anyone else to help." Samuel turned to look at her, something aching behind his eyes. "I'm sorry, Clara." "Everyone says that. It doesn't fix anything." "No," he agreed. "It doesn't, but I mean it anyway." Clara studied him for a long moment in the fading light, and something passed between them that neither of them had a name for, yet something too new and too fragile to be spoken aloud. "Why are you really here, Samuel Reed?" she asked softly. "A man like you. There's something under all that dust you're not telling me." William's heart pounded. The truth sat right there at the edge of his tongue, ready to spill out into the evening air. He almost said it. He almost said everything. Instead, he reached out and very carefully, very slowly took her hand in his, rough with new blisters, gentle in a way that surprised them both. "I'm here because you gave a stranger a seat at your table when you had every reason not to," he said. "That's reason enough for any man to stay." Clara did not pull her hand away. Does. The third trouble arrived without warning. The way the worst kind always does. A traveling drover named Tom Ashford stopped at the ranch for water on his way through the valley, leading a small string of horses toward the capital. Clara offered him a meal out of habit, the same habit that had once put a plate in front of a stranger named Samuel Reed. Ashford sat at the table, ate quickly, and talked the way tired travelers often did, too much too fast, filling silence with whatever crossed his mind. Then his eyes landed on Samuel, and something in his face changed. "You look mighty familiar," Ashford said, squinting across the table. "Awful familiar." Samuel kept his eyes on his plate. "Common face, I suppose." No, I've seen you before. I'd bet my horses on it." Ashford snapped his fingers, thinking hard. "You ever been through the capital? There's a man up there, big cattleman, owns half the territory. Practically you've got the same look about you. Same eyes. Damnedest thing." Clara's fork paused halfway to her mouth. Samuel's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Never been to the capital in my life," he said, and his voice was steady, though his pulse was not. "Must be someone else." Ashford studied him a moment longer, shrugged, and went back to his food, already losing interest, already moving on to some other thought. But Clara had not lost interest. She sat very still, watching Samuel's face, watching the way his hand had gone tense around his fork, watching the careful blankness he'd pulled over his features, like a curtain dropping shut. She said nothing while Ashford finished his meal and thanked her and rode off into the dusk with his string of horses. But once he was gone, once the sound of hooves had faded down the trail, Clara turned to Samuel with a look that was no longer soft. "Why did that man look at you like he knew you?" "I don't know. Strangers see what they want to see." "That's not an answer." "It's the only one I've got." Clara's eyes searched his face, and for the first time since she'd lowered her rifle and let him walk through her gate, real doubt crept into her expression, sharp and cold and impossible to unsee. "Samuel," she said slowly, "who are you really?" And William Hawthorne, standing in the fading light with the truth pressing hard against his teeth, did the only thing he could think to do. He looked away and he said nothing at all. Samuel said nothing, and the silence between them stretched longer than any sentence could have. Clara stood on the porch arms, crossed, waiting. He finally looked up. "I told you. Everyone's got things they don't talk about." "That's not an answer, Samuel. That's a wall." "Maybe it is." Clara studied him another long moment, jaw-tight eyes searching his face for something she couldn't name. Then she exhaled sharp and frustrated and turned toward the house. "Fine," she said. "Keep your wall, but don't expect me to pretend I didn't see it." She went inside and did not look back, and Samuel stood alone in the dark, hating himself more in that moment than he had in the 2 years since Evelyn's laughter chased him out of his own life. He had come here to test whether someone could love him without knowing his fortune. He had not expected the test to cost him her trust. Morning came, and neither of them spoke of it. Clara handed him a plate at breakfast, the same as always. Samuel thanked her the same as always, but something had shifted, something small and cold that hadn't been there the day before, and both of them felt it every time their eyes happened to meet across the table. "There's a broken axle on the wagon," Clara said, not looking up from her coffee. "Needs fixing before I can haul anything to town." "I'll look at it after chores." Fine. That was all. No warmth in it. No teasing. Just two people speaking around the thing neither of them would say out loud. Samuel worked on the axle through the morning hands, moving on instinct while his mind turned over everything he could have said and hadn't. By midday, sweat soaked through his shirt, and he still hadn't found the words. He heard Clara's footsteps before he saw her. "How's it coming?" "Slow. The woods rotted clean through on one side." She crouched beside him, studying the damage, and for a moment the tension between them eased, just slightly replaced by the simple shared problem in front of them. Can it be fixed? With the right wood, yes. Without it? He shook his head. "I could reinforce it. Might hold a few more months." A few months is all I needed to hold." Something in her voice caught his attention. He looked up. "Clara, don't." "I wasn't going to ask about the watch again." "Good, because I'm done asking." She stood brushing dirt from her skirt, and for a second she looked more tired than angry, more worn down than suspicious. "I don't have room left in me to wonder about secrets, Samuel. I've got 3 weeks to find $400 I don't have. Whatever you're hiding, I hope it's worth carrying." She walked away before he could answer, and Samuel sat back on his heels, staring after her, the weight of his own lie pressing harder against his chest than it ever had before. The wagon wheel gave out entirely 2 days later, and it very nearly took Clara's leg with it. She was hauling a load of feed sacks across the yard when the rotted axle finally snapped and the wagon lurched sideways with a violent crack. Clara threw herself clear on instinct, but not fast enough. The edge of the wagon bed caught her shoulder and sent her sprawling hard into the dirt. "Clara!" Samuel was across the yard before she'd even finished falling, dropping to his knees beside her hands, hovering afraid to touch and afraid not to. "Don't move. Just don't move yet." "I'm fine." Her voice was tight with pain, even as she said it. "I'm fine, Samuel." "You're not fine. You're gray as a ghost. Where does it hurt?" "Shoulder, maybe my wrist." She tried to sit up and gasped, and Samuel's hand came to her back without thinking, steadying her. "Easy. Easy, I've got you." For a moment neither of them moved. Clara's breath came in short, pained pulls, and Samuel knelt there with his arm around her, close enough to feel her trembling, close enough that the anger of the last 2 days simply evaporated in the face of something far more urgent. "I told you that axle wasn't safe," he said quietly. "You didn't tell me it would try to kill me. I'm telling you now, no more hauling feed until it's fixed properly." Clara let out a shaky laugh despite the pain. "Bossy for a man with holes in his boots." "Maybe." Samuel helped her to her feet slowly, one arm still braced around her. "Can you walk?" "I can walk." She took a step and winced, and he tightened his hold without asking permission. "Lean on me." "I don't need—" "Lean on me, Clara. Just this once." She did. They walked back to the house together, slow and careful, and something about the silence between them now was different than the silence of the last 2 days. Softer, less guarded. By the time he'd settled her into a chair and wrapped her wrist with a strip of cloth, the anger had drained out of both of them entirely. "Thank you," Clara said quietly, watching his hands work. "You don't need to thank me for catching you. I don't mean the wrist." She looked up at him. "I mean for not letting me pretend I was fine when I wasn't." Samuel's hands stilled on the bandage. "That's what people who care about you do," he said. "They don't let you pretend." Something passed between them in that moment, quiet, fragile, unspoken, and Clara did not pull her hand away when he finished tying the bandage and simply held it a moment longer than necessary. 3 days later, Clara rode into town with what little she could spare, a half-dozen hens, 2 bolts of fabric she'd woven herself, and the last of the previous season's preserves, hoping to scrape together enough coin to put toward the debt. She came home with less than she left with. Samuel found her unhitching the horse in silence, her face set in hard, flat lines that told him everything before she said a word. "How much did you get?" $6. Her voice was clipped, furious. $6, Samuel. The man at the general store said prices were down, said he could barely afford what he was offering me. And not 2 hours later, I watched him sell eggs to another woman for triple what he paid me for mine. That's robbery. That's business, apparently. When you're a widow with no husband to stand behind you, everyone in town suddenly discovers they're short on cash. She yanked the saddle free with more force than necessary. Jacob Pratt was there too, watching, smiling that same smile he always wears when he thinks he's winning. Samuel's jaw tightened. What did he say? He didn't have to say anything. He just watched me get cheated and tipped his hat like it was the finest entertainment he'd seen all week. Clara threw the saddle over the fence rail harder than it needed. $6. I need 400, and I walked away with 6. Clara, don't. Her voice cracked just slightly, just enough to reveal how close to breaking she really was. Don't tell me it'll work out. Don't tell me something will turn up. I've heard enough kind lies this week to last a lifetime. Samuel stood there aching to tell her the truth that he could solve this with a single letter, a single signature, a single trip to the bank in his own name. The words pressed against his teeth so hard it physically hurt to hold them back. I'm not going to lie to you, he said instead, quiet and steady. I don't know how this ends, but I know you're not facing it alone, and that has to count for something. Clara looked at him, eyes bright with unshed tears she refused to let fall. Does it? She whispered. Because right now, Samuel alone might be easier than watching someone else struggle right alongside me with no way to help either. She walked into the house before he could answer, and Samuel stood in the yard, long after dark, staring up at nothing, hating the coat on his back and the false name in his mouth more than he had ever hated anything in his life. That night, he wrote the letter. He sat in the barn by lantern-light pencil, trembling slightly in his grip, and addressed it to Harrison Cole, his lawyer in the territorial capital, a man William Hawthorne trusted with everything, a man who had never once asked more of William than his word. Harrison need you to look into a debt claim against a property in the Cedar Creek Valley owner, Clara Whitmore, widow. Alleged note, signed by her late husband Thomas Whitmore, held by First Territorial Bank. Something about it doesn't sit right. Deadline being pushed aggressively. Find out who's really behind the paperwork. Discretion required, do not use my name in any inquiry. Will explain everything when I can. W. He read it twice, folded it carefully, and hid it inside his coat lining beside the pocket watch, waiting for the next chance he had to ride into town, unnoticed, and post it. It was the first real thing he had done with his true identity since arriving at Clara's gate. It would not be the last. The chance came 2 mornings later when Clara asked him to ride into town for supplies while she stayed behind to tend a sick calf. Samuel posted the letter at the small post office with his coat collar turned up and his hat pulled low, paying the clerk with coins. He'd been careful never to let Clara see him carry, and turned to leave before anyone could look at him too closely. He nearly succeeded. Read. Samuel froze. Jacob Pratt stood just outside the post office door, arms crossed, watching him with narrowed eyes. Mr. Pratt, didn't expect to see you handling business in town. Thought drifters like you didn't have business to handle? Just posting a letter. Who's a penniless ranch hand writing letters to... Samuel's pulse spiked, though his face stayed carefully blank. Family. Back east. Didn't take you for a man with family. Everyone's got family, Mr. Pratt. Whether they talk to them is another matter. Pratt studied him a long moment, suspicion evident in every line of his face, and Samuel forced himself to hold the man's gaze without flinching, the way he'd learned to hold a boardroom's gaze years ago, back when he still wore his own name. You're a strange one, Reed, Pratt said finally. I've got half a mind to write my own letter, find out exactly who you are and where you really came from. Do what you feel you need to do. Careful, Pratt said, voice dropping low. That kind of confidence doesn't suit a man with holes in his boots. He walked away, and Samuel stood outside the post office with his heart hammering, watching Pratt's retreating back, understanding with sudden cold clarity that the man suspected something, not the truth, not yet, but something, and that suspicion was a fuse already lit. Clara noticed the change in him the moment he returned. You're quiet, she said, watching him unload the supplies from the wagon. Quieter than usual. Long ride. That's not it. She crossed her arms, studying him the way she'd studied him the night Ashford recognized his face. Something happened in town. Nothing happened. Samuel. Clara, please, just let it be this once. Something in his voice must have convinced her, or maybe she simply didn't have the strength left to fight another battle that day because she nodded slowly and let the subject drop, though her eyes stayed on him a moment longer than comfortable. All right, she said quietly. But I'm keeping count, you know. Every time you say, let it be. One day that count is going to run out. I know. Do you? Samuel met her gaze steady and honest for the first time in days, even if the honesty could only go so far. I know exactly how much I owe you, Clara. More than you'd believe. And I intend to pay every bit of it one way or another. She didn't understand the weight behind his words. Not then. But something in his tone made her chest tighten anyway. Made her look away first. Made her busy. Her hands with the supplies instead of holding his gaze any longer. Neither of them spoke of it again that evening. But something had shifted, some quiet understanding neither could name, and it sat between them at the supper table like a third presence, patient and waiting. Just some. Elias Cobb returned 4 days later, and this time he brought a second man with him. Younger, nervous, carrying a leather satchel of documents he would not meet Clara's eyes over. Mrs. Whitmore, this is Mr. Halloway from the bank's legal office. He's here to review the note in question, given the concerns you raised. Clara straightened, cautious hope flickering across her face. You're reviewing the signature, as a courtesy, Cobb said smoothly. Though I should warn you, Mrs. Whitmore banks rarely find in favor of contested claims. The paperwork tends to speak for itself. Halloway laid the document out on Clara's porch railing, and for the first time, Clara got a long, careful look at the signature that had upended her entire life. She stared at it, stared at the loops of her husband's name, the particular slant of the T in Thomas. That's not his hand, she said quietly. With respect, Mrs. Whitmore, grief has a way of... I buried that man. Clara snapped sharper than she meant to. I watched him write 100 letters in that same hand. I know what his signature looks like, Mr. Halloway, and that is not it. Look at the T. Thomas always crossed his T's high near the top of the letter. This one crosses low, every single time low. Halloway glanced at Cobb, uncertain. Cobb's expression did not shift, though something behind his eyes tightened. An interesting observation, Cobb said, though hardly conclusive. It's more conclusive than anything you've offered me. Mrs. Whitmore, I understand this is difficult. Don't patronize me, Mr. Cobb. I want this signature compared against documents my husband actually signed. There are contracts in the county recorder's office, cattle sale receipts, a dozen places where his real signature exists. Compare them. Cobb's smile thinned just slightly, just enough that Samuel, standing near the barn close enough to hear every word, caught the flicker of something underneath it. Not confidence. Something closer to alarm. That request would require additional time, Cobb said carefully. I have 3 weeks, Mr. Cobb. Take whatever time you need out of it. I'm not paying a debt my husband never signed for. For the first time since this entire ordeal began, Clara watched Elias Cobb's composure crack, just barely, just enough to confirm what she'd suspected in her bones since the very first letter arrived. Something about this was wrong, deeply, deliberately wrong. I'll relay your request, Cobb said stiffly, gathering the documents. Good day, Mrs. Whitmore. He and Halloway rode off, and Clara stood on the porch with her arms wrapped around herself, shaking not with grief this time, but with something closer to fury. Samuel crossed the yard to her side. You were right, he said quietly. About the signature. I was right about all of it. Clara's voice trembled with the effort of holding back tears of rage. Someone forged my husband's name, Samuel. Someone wanted this land badly enough to fake a dead man's handwriting, and I intend to find out exactly who. You will? You sound very sure of that. I am. Clara looked at him. Something searching in her expression again. But this time it wasn't suspicion. It was something closer to gratitude, closer to trust, rebuilding itself, one careful brick at a time. Why do you care so much, Samuel, truly? A drifter passing through could have kept walking the day that first bank letter arrived. You stayed. You keep staying even when I give you every reason to leave. Samuel held her gaze, and for one dangerous moment, the truth nearly broke free of him entirely. Because some things are worth staying for, he said instead. Even when staying costs you something. Clara did not press further, but she did not look away either, and the moment stretched between them, warm and fragile, until the sound of hoofbeats in the distance broke it entirely. Well, the hoofbeats belonged to a boy from town, no older than 14, riding hard and out of breath. "Mrs. Whitmore, Mrs. Whitmore, there's trouble at your northern fence line." Clara's stomach dropped. "What kind of trouble?" "Cattle got loose. A whole sections down looks tore apart deliberate-like, not just old wood giving way. My pa sent me to warn you before more of your stock wanders off toward the ravine." Samuel was already moving toward the horses before the boy finished speaking. How many head could be out there? Hard to say. Could be a dozen, could be more. Clara's face went pale. A dozen head of cattle was nearly everything she had left. Losing them to the ravine, or to whoever had torn down that fence, would be the final blow before the bank's deadline even arrived. "Samuel." "I'm going. Stay here in case Cobb comes back with more paperwork." "I'm not staying here while my herd runs wild, Samuel Reed." "Clara, it's rough country out toward that ravine, and it'll be dark inside 2 hours." "It's my ranch." Her voice left no room for argument. "I ride." They rode hard toward the northern boundary, and what they found there made Clara's breath catch in her throat. The fence hadn't simply broken. It had been cut clean, deliberate cuts through wood that had held solid for 3 winters, running the kind of damage that came from human hands and human intent, not weather or time. "Someone did this on purpose," Samuel said grimly, examining the severed rail. "Pratt." "We don't know that for certain." "Don't we?" Clara's eyes blazed. "He watched me get cheated in town without lifting a finger. He's made no secret of wanting this land. And now, 3 weeks before the bank's deadline, someone cuts my fence and scatters my herd toward a ravine that could kill half of them." Samuel didn't answer because he was already thinking the same thing, already feeling the same cold fury building beneath his ribs. "We need to find the cattle before dark," he said instead. "We can settle who did this later." They spent the next 2 hours combing the rough country along the ravine's edge, Clara's voice growing hoarse from calling Samuel's horse lathered from the pace. They found 8 head grazing nervously near the tree line, 3 more caught in a shallow gully, spooked but unhurt. 1 was missing entirely. "Old Bessie," Clara said quietly, staring out at the darkening ravine. "She's slow. She wouldn't have kept pace with the others." "We'll look at first light. She could be dead by first light, Samuel. She could be at the bottom of that ravine right now." Samuel reached out, steadying her by the shoulder before she could ride toward the ravine's edge in the failing light. "And you could break your neck looking for her in the dark. I know it hurts, Clara. I know every single loss right now feels like the whole world collapsing. But you have to be alive to save this ranch. Bessie wouldn't want you dead over her." Clara's shoulders sagged, the fight draining out of her all at once, replaced by something rawer and more exhausted. "I can't keep losing things, Samuel," she whispered. "I can't. First Thomas, then the debt. Now this. How much is one person supposed to lose before there's nothing left to hold on to?" Samuel pulled her into him without thinking twice, and this time Clara did not resist, did not pull away, simply let herself lean into him in the fading light, shaking with exhaustion and grief and fury, all tangled together. "You're not going to lose this place," Samuel said fiercely, quietly against her hair. "I swear it to you, Clara. Whatever it takes, I swear it." "You can't promise that." "I just did." She looked up at him, and in the dying light, something passed between them that neither had let themselves feel before, not fully. Not without the armor of suspicion or grief standing guard. For one long moment, Samuel thought he might kiss her. For one long moment, Clara thought she might let him. Then a distant, mournful bellow echoed up from the ravine, and both of them startled apart, hearts pounding for an entirely different reason. "Bessie," Clara breathed. They found the old cow half stuck in a muddy embankment near the ravine's base, exhausted but alive, and it took the better part of an hour and every ounce of strength both of them had to haul her free in the dark. By the time they rode back to the house, bone-tired and mud-streaked, the moment between them had passed. but it had not disappeared. Pratt showed up the very next morning, before Clara had even finished her coffee riding in, with an expression of practiced concern that fooled no one. "Heard about your fence trouble," he said, not bothering to dismount. "Terrible thing. Cattle running loose is a dangerous business this time of year." "It's an interesting coincidence," Clara said, standing on her porch with her arms crossed, "that my fence gets cut clean through with a blade 3 weeks before my deadline, and you're the first person to come asking about it. I heard it from town gossip, same as anyone." "Did you?" "You sound like you're accusing me of something, Clara." "I'm not accusing you of anything, Jacob. I'm simply noting that trouble seems to follow wherever you show the most interest." Pratt's expression hardened, the mask of concern slipping just slightly. "You're making a mistake keeping that drifter around instead of accepting a real offer of help. Men like him don't stay, Clara. They drift in, they eat your food, they take advantage of a lonely widow's kindness, and one morning you'll wake up and he'll be gone, and you'll still be exactly where you started, except poorer for having fed him all these weeks." "Get off my property, Jacob." "I'm only trying to—" "I said get off my property." Clara's voice cracked like a whip across the yard. "You've offered me your help exactly once, and it came with a wedding ring attached, and my creek is the real prize. I don't need any more of your concern." Pratt stared down at her a long moment, something calculating behind his eyes. "You'll regret this, Clara. Pride is a poor substitute for a roof over your head." "I'll take my chances." He rode off without another word, and Clara stood there shaking with the aftermath of her own fury, watching him disappear down the trail. Samuel came around the side of the house, having heard every word. "You didn't have to do that." "Yes, I did." Clara's chin lifted defiant even through her exhaustion. "I'm tired of men deciding what's best for me because they think a widow with a struggling ranch has run out of choices. I haven't run out of choices, Samuel. I've just run out of patience for the ones who think my desperation makes me stupid." Something in Samuel's chest swelled with a feeling he barely recognized. Pride, admiration. Something deeper he didn't yet have a name for. "You're the strongest person I've ever met," he said quietly. Clara looked at him, surprised by the sudden weight of the compliment. "You don't know that many people, Samuel Reed. You've been on the road for months." "I know enough," he said. "I know enough to recognize it when I see it." Job. The following week brought no relief. Cobb returned with word that the comparison of signatures Clara had demanded would take considerable time to process, conveniently stretching well past her deadline. Halloway did not accompany him this time, and Cobb's manner had grown colder, more clipped, more impatient. "The deadline stands, Mrs. Whitmore. 2 weeks. Whatever questions you have about the signature can be raised after the debt is settled." "That's absurd. You can't demand payment on a debt you haven't even confirmed is real." "The bank believes it's confirmed. Your objections are noted, but they don't change the timeline." Clara's hands curled into fists at her sides. "This is fraud, Mr. Cobb. I don't know who's behind it, but I know a forged signature when I see one, and I know a rigged deadline when I'm living inside it. Those are serious accusations. They're serious circumstances." Cobb studied her a long moment, something unreadable behind his composed expression. 2 weeks, Mrs. Whitmore. I'd advise you to spend them finding $400 rather than chasing ghosts in old handwriting." He rode off, and Clara turned to find Samuel standing behind her, jaw tight with barely restrained anger. 2 weeks, she said hollowly. "He keeps cutting the time. First 6 weeks, then 3, now 2. Every time I push back, he shortens it further, like he's punishing me for asking questions." "That's exactly what he's doing." "How do you know that—" Samuel caught himself, the words having slipped out with more certainty than a drifter should possess. "Just a feeling," he said quickly. "Men who tighten deadlines when questioned are usually men with something to hide." Clara studied him a moment, that old flicker of suspicion crossing her face again, but exhaustion and fear pushed it aside faster than it could take root. 2 weeks, she repeated softly. "I don't know what I'm going to do, Samuel." "We'll think of something." "We." She looked up at him, something fragile and searching in her expression. You keep saying we like this is your fight, too. Maybe it is. Why? The question hung in the air between them, heavy with everything Samuel still couldn't say. Because I care what happens to you, Clara, he said finally. Voice low and rough, with an honesty that startled them both. More than I expected to. More than I know what to do with. Clara's breath caught. For a long moment, neither of them moved the space between them, charged with something neither had dared name aloud until now. Samuel, I know I'm not what you deserve, he said quickly before she could finish. I know I showed up here with nothing, and I've given you nothing since but trouble and questions you can't get answers to. But I need you to know that whatever happens with this ranch, whatever happens with the bank, I'm not walking away from you, not now. Maybe not ever. Clara's eyes glistened, and this time she did not fight the tears that rose. You can't promise forever, Samuel. Not when I don't even know your real story. I know, he whispered, but I'm promising it anyway. She reached up, resting her palm against his jaw, and for a moment, the entire weight of the debt, the deadline, the forged signature, and every lie between them fell away, leaving only the two of them standing in the fading light. He leaned down. She rose onto her toes. Their lips had barely brushed when the sound of a rider thundering up the drive shattered the moment entirely. Both of them turned, startled hearts pounding for reasons that had nothing to do with each other now. The rider was Harrison Cole's courier, Dusty from hard travel, holding a sealed letter addressed not to Samuel Reed, but to William Hawthorne. Clara's eyes moved from the courier's face to the letter in his outstretched hand, and then slowly, terribly to Samuel, whose own face had gone the color of ash. Samuel, she said very quietly, very carefully. Why is that man asking for someone named William Hawthorne on my property? The courier held the letter higher, waiting, and Clara did not move to take it. Her eyes stayed locked on Samuel, and the silence between them stretched so taut it felt like something that might snap and cut them both. Samuel. Clara, let me explain. That's not an answer. Her voice had gone very quiet, very still, the kind of stillness that came right before a storm broke loose. Why is a man asking for William Hawthorne standing on my land? The courier, sensing the danger in the air, cleared his throat awkwardly. Begging your pardon, ma'am. Mr. Cole sent me directly from the capital. Said to put this letter in the hands of William Hawthorne personal no matter where I found him. Said it concerned an urgent matter. And you found him here? Clara said slowly. On my ranch. Yes, ma'am. Description matched exact. Tall, dark-haired answers to Samuel most days, but flinches a bit when you say the other name. Clara turned back to Samuel, and whatever softness had lived in her face a moment ago, the softness of an almost kiss of a promise, not yet a minute old, had vanished entirely, replaced by something harder, colder, more dangerous than fury. Take the letter, she said to the courier without looking away from Samuel. Then get off my land. The courier did as he was told, pressing the sealed envelope into Samuel's hand before mounting up and riding off fast, clearly eager to be anywhere else. Samuel stood there holding the letter like it might catch fire in his grip. Clara, I can explain everything. Then explain. Her arms crossed hard over her chest, a wall going up brick by brick right in front of him. Right now. No more watches that were your father's. No more common faces. No more walls, Samuel, or whoever you are. Explain. He opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. My name is William Hawthorne. The words landed in the yard like a gunshot. Clara didn't move, didn't breathe for a moment. Say that again. My name is William Hawthorne. He repeated quieter now, the false name falling away from him like a coat he could no longer wear. Samuel Reed isn't real. I made him up 3 months ago. Why? One word, flat, furious. I own land, Clara, a great deal of land, 12,000 acres in the Northern Territory, cattle, a house in the capital, more money than... He stopped himself, seeing her face change with every word, watching horror bloom where trust had only just begun to grow. More money than this entire valley sees in a decade. Clara took a step back from him, as if putting distance between herself and something dangerous. You're rich. Clara, you're rich, she said again, disbelief cracking through her voice. You let me. I gave you a seat at my table. I gave you my last coat when you were cold. I told you about Thomas. I told you things I haven't told another living soul, and this whole time you had 12,000 acres and a mansion waiting for you, and you said nothing. I was going to tell you. When? After the wedding. After I'd spent my whole life believing I'd married a penniless drifter out of love, only to find out he was laughing at me the entire time. I was never laughing at you. William's voice broke with the force of his own desperation. Clara, I swear to you, I was never laughing. Then what were you doing? Her voice rose sharp and raw. What exactly was the purpose of lying to a woman who was about to lose everything she owned? William's shoulders sagged, the weight of 3 months finally crashing down all at once. I needed to know, he said quietly, if someone could ever choose me. Not my land, not my money, me. Clara stared at him. What are you talking about? 2 years ago, I was engaged to a woman named Evelyn Carr. I overheard her telling her sister she'd have married a toad if the toad owned my land. I called off the wedding that same week and never told anyone why. And after that, I couldn't trust a single smile pointed in my direction because I never knew if it was meant for me or for what I owned. His hands trembled slightly as he spoke, the confession spilling out faster now that the dam had broken. So I left. I put on old clothes, I took a false name, and I went looking for someone who would treat a poor stranger like he mattered. I wasn't trying to hurt you, Clara. I was trying to find out if love like that even existed. Clara's eyes filled, but her jaw stayed hard, unforgiving. And did you find your answer? Yes. Good for you. Her voice cracked down the middle. Because I didn't get an answer to anything. I got a lie. Every single day for weeks I got a lie. Clara, please. You let me fall for a man who doesn't exist. Tears spilled freely now, angry and hot. Samuel Reed doesn't exist, William. I don't know you. I never knew you. I knew a story you invented to test whether a desperate widow was different from the people who hurt you. That's not fair. Fair. She laughed, a broken, furious sound. You want to talk about fair? I am 2 weeks now from losing everything my husband ever gave me. And this whole time the man sleeping in my barn could have solved it with the money in one pocket of his coat. You watched me sell hens for pennies in town. You watched Jacob Pratt humiliate me. You watched me claw through every possible option, terrified, exhausted, and you said nothing, because you were too busy running your little experiment to care that I was drowning. William flinched, like she'd struck him, because in every way that mattered she had. You're right, he said hoarsely. I should have told you the moment I understood what you were facing. I let my own fear keep me quiet when you needed help, and there's no excuse good enough to cover that. I'm sorry, Clara. I am more sorry than I know how to say. Sorry doesn't undo 3 weeks of lying to my face. No, he agreed. It doesn't. Clara wiped furiously at her eyes, hating that she was crying in front of him, hating that some traitorous part of her chest still ached for the man she'd almost kissed not 5 minutes ago, a man who apparently had never existed at all. Get off my land, William. The name came out of her mouth like something bitter. Clara. Get off my land, she said again, louder, sharper. You've got your fortune to run back to. Go run back to it. Let me help you first. Let me fix the debt. Let me deal with Cobb and whoever's behind this fraud. I don't want your help. The words tore out of her raw and furious. Don't you understand? I never wanted a rich man's charity. I wanted a partner. I wanted someone who chose to stand beside me because he meant it, not because he was testing whether I'd pass some cruel little examination you dreamed up to soothe your own wounded pride. It wasn't like that. It was exactly like that. Clara's voice shook with the effort of holding herself together. You didn't trust me enough to tell me the truth, and now you want me to trust you enough to take your money. You can't have it both ways, William. Pack your things, take your horse, and don't come back. William stood frozen in the yard, every argument dying in his throat, because he understood with a clarity that gutted him that she was right about all of it. He had wanted her honesty while withholding his own. He had wanted her trust while giving her nothing to build it on but a lie with a kind face. "All right," he said finally, voice hollow. "I'll go." He turned toward the barn, and Clara watched him walk away, with her arms wrapped tight around herself, holding in every sob that wanted to break free, refusing to let him see her fall apart twice in one conversation. He was gone within the hour. Clara stood on the porch and watched the same tired horse carry the same worn coat down the same trail he'd arrived on weeks before. Except now she knew the coat was a costume, and the exhaustion had been real, but the poverty had been theater every bit of it, and the knowledge sat in her chest like a stone she couldn't swallow. She did not cry until he was well out of sight. Then she sat down hard on the porch step and wept until there was nothing left in her. Wept for Thomas. Wept for the ranch. Wept for a man named Samuel who had never existed, and a man named William she didn't know at all. Wept until the sun dropped low and the yard went gray and cold around her. She was still sitting there when she noticed the letter. It had fallen from William's coat as he mounted his horse, or perhaps he'd left it deliberately, she would never know which, and it lay half buried in the dirt near the barn, the seal from Harrison Cole still unbroken. Clara stared at it a long moment before finally rising and picking it up. She should have thrown it in the fire. She should have burned it without reading a word, sent it to ash, the same way William Hawthorne had sent her trust to ash. Instead, with trembling hands, she broke the seal. William findings are troubling. First Territorial Bank shows no record of a loan originated to Thomas Whitmore. Signature on the note you described does not match any documents in county records bearing his name. More concerning, the note was co-signed as guarantor by a local landholder, Jacob Pratt, who would assume the mortgage rights should the original debt default. Recommend immediate legal action. This has the shape of deliberate fraud, and I believe Pratt is at the center of it, working in concert with a bank agent named Cobb. Contact me the moment you receive this. H.C. Clara read the letter 3 times before the words fully settled into her understanding. Jacob Pratt. Not a distant bank in Denver. Not some faceless institution. Jacob Pratt himself standing as guarantor on a fraudulent note positioned to inherit her land the very moment she defaulted. Her hands shook so badly the paper rattled. "He forged it," she whispered into the empty yard. "He forged Thomas's signature himself." Every conversation over the past month rearranged itself in her mind with horrifying new clarity. Pratt's convenient offer of marriage. Pratt's suspicious appearance the morning after her fence was cut. Pratt's cold satisfaction watching her get cheated in town like a man watching an investment mature exactly as planned. He hadn't been circling out of simple greed for her water rights. He had built the trap himself, brick by careful brick, and now he was simply waiting for her to fall into it. Clara did not sleep that night. She sat at her kitchen table with the lantern burning low, and Harrison Cole's letter spread out in front of her, reading it again and again until the words blurred, until fury and fear tangled together so tightly in her chest she could barely breathe. By morning, she had made a decision. She rode to town at first light, letter tucked safely inside her coat, and went straight to the office of the one man in the county whose integrity she still trusted. Judge Elias Marsh, who had presided over Thomas's estate 2 years earlier and knew every detail of what her husband had and had not owed. "Mrs. Whitmore." The judge looked up from his desk, surprised. "This is early even for you?" "Judge Marsh, I need your help. I believe I've been the target of deliberate fraud." She laid the letter on his desk, along with the original foreclosure notice, and watched his expression shift from polite confusion to sharp, focused attention as he read. "Where did you obtain this letter?" "It doesn't matter where. What matters is whether it's true. Is there a way to compare my husband's real signature against the one on the bank's note?" "There is." County records hold 3 separate documents bearing Thomas Whitmore's signature: a cattle sale contract, a property tax filing, and his original land grant. Marsh's frown deepened as he studied the letter again. And you're telling me Jacob Pratt is named as guarantor on this disputed note? According to that letter, yes. That's a serious accusation, Mrs. Whitmore. I'm aware. That's why I'm asking you to help me prove it, not simply take my word for it. Marsh studied her a long moment, something like respect flickering behind his tired eyes. Bring me the bank's note. I'll have my clerk pull the county documents for comparison. If the signatures don't match, we'll have grounds to halt the foreclosure and open a formal fraud investigation. Relief nearly buckled Clara's knees. Thank you, Judge Marsh. Don't thank me yet. Men like Pratt don't go down easy, especially not men with money and friends in the right offices. This will be a fight, Mrs. Whitmore, and not a short one. I've been fighting for 3 weeks already, Clara said, jaw set. I can fight a while longer. She rode home with something she hadn't felt in days. Not hope exactly, but its close cousin, a grim and steady determination that filled the hollow place William's departure had carved into her chest. She told herself she didn't think about him on the ride home. She told herself that 3 more times before she admitted it was a lie. The ranch felt different without him in it. The barn sat too quiet. The fences he'd mended stood as a constant reminder of hands that had worked beside her for weeks. Hands attached to a man whose name she still didn't fully know how to say without her voice catching. She busied herself with chores to keep from thinking about it, and she was elbow-deep in mending a torn saddle strap when Jacob Pratt rode into her yard, uninvited exactly as he always did. Clara. He tipped his hat all practiced charm. Heard your drifter finally moved along. Told you he wouldn't stay. Clara's hands went still on the leather strap, fury rising hot and immediate in her chest. She forced herself to keep her voice level to give nothing away. News travels fast. Small valley. He dismounted far too comfortable for a man standing on land he had no right to. I came to renew my offer. Deadline's closing in, Clara. I'd hate to see you lose everything out of stubbornness. How generous of you. I mean it sincerely. Do you? Clara set the saddle strap down slowly, deliberately, and turned to face him fully. Tell me something, Jacob. How exactly did the bank come to hold a note my husband never signed? Something flickered behind Pratt's eyes, quick, careful, but not quite quick enough. I wouldn't know anything about bank paperwork. Wouldn't you? Clara took a step closer, watching him with new eyes. Eyes that finally understood the shape of the trap she'd been standing inside for weeks. Because I've seen the note, Jacob, and I know a forged signature when I look at it long enough. Thomas never crossed his T's the way that signature does. Grief plays tricks on memory, Clara. Grief didn't sign that note. Someone else did. She held his gaze unflinching, watching every flicker of unease cross his composed features. And I intend to find out exactly who. Pratt's jaw tightened, the charming mask slipping just enough to reveal something colder underneath. You should be careful making accusations you can't prove. I didn't accuse you of anything, Jacob. I only said I intend to find out who forged it. Clara smiled thin and sharp. Interesting that you'd take it so personally. For a long moment, Pratt said nothing, and in that silence, Clara watched the calculation happening behind his eyes, weighing threat against denial. Weighing how much she truly knew against how much he could still bluff his way past. 2 weeks. Clara, he said finally. Voice low and dangerous, now all pretense of charm gone. The deadline stands regardless of whatever fantasies you're chasing. I'd think very carefully about who you accuse in this valley. Reputations are fragile things, and so is a woman's standing when she's alone with no husband and no drifter to hide behind. Is that a threat, Jacob? It's a fact. He remounted his horse, looking down at her with something that had curdled entirely past charm, now into something closer to menace. Enjoy your remaining 2 weeks. He rode off, and Clara stood in her yard with her pulse hammering, more certain than ever that she'd found the man behind the fraud, and more aware than ever of exactly how dangerous cornering him might prove to be. 3 days passed in tense, watchful quiet. Clara returned twice to Judge Marsh's office, and each time the news was maddeningly slow. The clerk was comparing documents letter by letter, stroke by stroke, a process that could not be rushed no matter how badly Clara wanted it finished. "I understand your urgency, Mrs. Whitmore," Marsh told her on the second visit, not unkindly. "But sloppy work gives men like Pratt room to wriggle free in court. We do this carefully, or we don't do it at all. I have less than 2 weeks. I'm aware. I've asked the clerk to prioritize this above all else. That's the most I can offer you." Clara rode home each time with her nerves stretched thinner, the silence of the empty ranch pressing harder against her with every passing day. She caught herself more than once glancing toward the barn, out of habit, expecting to see a familiar figure repairing something that didn't need repairing, only to remember all over again that he was gone. She hated how much that absence hurt. She hated it more than she hated the debt itself some days, and that realization frightened her far more than any bank notice ever had. It was on the 4th day that Harrison Cole himself arrived at her gate, a tall, precise man with sharp eyes and a lawyer's careful way of choosing every word. "Mrs. Whitmore, my name is Harrison Cole. I believe you're already familiar with a letter I sent." Clara's guard went up instantly. "You're William's lawyer." "I am, and I understand from his last correspondence that circumstances between the two of you have grown complicated." "That's a generous word for it." Cole allowed himself a small, tired smile. "William asked me to look into your situation before any of this became complicated, Mrs. Whitmore, out of genuine concern for what was happening to you. Whatever else has passed between you, I want you to understand that his interest in uncovering this fraud predates any falling out." "That doesn't excuse the lying." "No," Cole agreed simply. "It doesn't. I'm not here to excuse him. I'm here because my findings have grown more serious since that letter, and I believed you deserved to hear them directly rather than through another courier." Clara's stomach tightened. "What did you find?" "The forged signature isn't the only irregularity. I traced the note's origin to a private arrangement between Jacob Pratt and a bank agent named Elias Cobb. Pratt paid Cobb a substantial sum 8 months ago, shortly after your husband's death, Mrs. Whitmore, to manufacture a debt against this property. The plan was simple: force you into default, seize the land through the guarantor clause, and absorb your water rights into his own holdings, all under the appearance of a legitimate bank transaction. Clara's knees went weak and she gripped the porch railing to steady herself. 8 months, she whispered. He's been planning this for 8 months. It appears so. Since Thomas died. Her voice cracked with fresh fury. He waited until I was alone, until I had no one left to fight for me, and then he built this whole trap knowing I'd have nowhere to turn. That does appear to be the case, yes. Clara pressed a hand to her mouth, fighting to hold herself together against the sheer scale of the cruelty she was only now beginning to fully understand. Can this be proven in court with a judge with everything that's needed to actually stop him? I believe so. I have bank correspondence testimony from a clerk willing to speak against Cobb in exchange for leniency, and now this signature comparison your own Judge Marsh is conducting. Combined, it should be more than sufficient to void the note entirely and bring formal charges against both men. Relief and fury crashed through Clara at once, so overwhelming she had to sit down on the porch step to keep from swaying. Why are you telling me this yourself? Why not simply send another letter? Cole hesitated, something almost gentle crossing his sharp features. Because William asked me to make certain you had everything you needed to fight this, regardless of what happens between the two of you personally. He was very clear on that point, Mrs. Whitmore. Whatever anger you feel toward him, and by his own account, you have every right to feel it, he did not want you facing Pratt and Cobb without the full truth in your hands. Clara looked away, blinking hard against tears she refused to let fall in front of a stranger. Where is he now? At his estate last I knew, though I suspect he's not sleeping much if his letters to me are any indication. That's not my concern anymore. Of course. Cole's tone carried no judgment, only careful neutrality. I'll leave copies of everything I've found with Judge Marsh directly. I imagine between his investigation and mine, you'll have more than enough to end this within the week. He left shortly after, and Clara sat alone on her porch step for a long time, staring out at the fences. William had mended the corral, he had rebuilt the porch step he had fixed, with his own careful hands, weeks before she knew a single true thing about him. She hated that some part of her still hoped he was thinking of her too. The final confrontation came faster than anyone expected. Word of the fraud investigation reached Cobb before Judge Marsh had even finished his formal report, and the bank agent panicked. Cornered, desperate to save himself, made the mistake that broke the entire scheme wide open. He rode straight to Jacob Pratt's ranch in broad daylight, in full view of two ranch hands, who would later testify to every word, and the argument that followed was loud enough to carry across the yard. "You told me this was airtight." Cobb's voice cracked with panic. "You told me no one would ever compare the signatures. Keep your voice down, you fool. I'm facing prison, Pratt. You said this would be clean. It would have stayed clean if you hadn't gotten sloppy with the paperwork. Me. You're the one who insisted on tightening the deadline every time she pushed back, drawing more attention to it every single time." The ranch hand's testimony, combined with Harrison Cole's documentation and Judge Marsh's completed signature comparison, arrived on the county sheriff's desk within 48 hours. And the sheriff, a weathered, unimpressed man named Garrett Boone, who had never much cared for Jacob Pratt's heirs, rode out to make the arrests personally. Clara heard about it from the same 14-year-old boy who had once ridden hard to warn her about the cut fence, breathless and wide-eyed with the news. They arrested him. "Mrs. Whitmore, Sheriff Boone hauled Jacob Pratt off in irons not an hour ago right in front of half the town. And that bank fella Cobb, too, turned on Pratt the second the sheriff started asking questions, spilled the whole scheme trying to save his own neck." Clara stood frozen in her yard, the news washing over her in waves she could barely process. "It's over," she whispered. "It's actually over." "Judge said the note's voided, ma'am. Said there ain't no debt no more on account of it never being real in the first place." Relief crashed through her so violently, her legs nearly gave out, and she had to grip the porch railing to keep from collapsing entirely. Laughing and crying in the same shuddering breath, the weight of 2 months finally lifting off her chest. The ranch was hers. Truly, legally, entirely hers, with no forged debt hanging over it, no deadline closing in, no Jacob Pratt circling like a vulture waiting for her to fall. She had won. But standing alone in her yard, with the good news ringing in her ears, Clara realized the victory felt strangely hollow, because the one person she most wanted to tell wasn't there to hear it. She rode into town the next morning to see it for herself. Jacob Pratt's ranch already swarming with county officials, his prized cattle being cataloged for seizure pending trial. His reputation collapsing in real time in front of an audience that had once envied his fortune and now watched his downfall with undisguised satisfaction. Elias Cobb had already confessed everything, in exchange for a lighter sentence laying out the scheme in exhausting detail, how Pratt had approached him 8 months earlier with cash, and a plan how they'd forged the signature using an old land document as reference. How they'd tightened the deadline deliberately every time Clara asked too many uncomfortable questions. "He said you'd fold eventually," Cobb told her when she confronted him briefly outside the jailhouse, some strange mixture of guilt and self-pity in his voice. "Said a widow alone would always fold given enough pressure. He was wrong about you, Mrs. Whitmore. I'll give you that much." Clara looked at him with nothing but contempt. "You forged a dead man's name for money, Mr. Cobb. Don't expect gratitude for admitting it after you got caught." She turned and walked away, leaving him standing there, and made her way toward Judge Marsh's office to finalize the paperwork that would formally close the matter for good. The judge greeted her with something close to warmth, a rare thing from a man usually so carefully neutral. "Congratulations, Mrs. Whitmore. The note is void. Your land is secure, free, and clear with no further claim against it. I dare say you've had quite the ordeal these past months." "You have no idea," Clara said quietly, though something in her voice carried more exhaustion than triumph. Marsh studied her a moment, perceptive despite his age. "May I ask the man who was staying with you? Mr. Reed, I believe he was called around here. Was he involved in uncovering all this?" Clara's throat tightened. "His name isn't Reed." "Ah." Marsh's eyebrows lifted slightly, but he asked nothing further, simply nodded like a man who understood more than he let on. Well, whoever he is, his lawyer's documentation proved invaluable to this case. You might consider that worth something, whatever else has passed between you. Clara said nothing, because she didn't trust her voice not to break if she tried. She rode home that evening with her land finally truly safe, and the strange hollow ache in her chest only grew heavier with every mile, because the fight was over, and she had won everything she'd been desperate to save. Everything except the one thing she hadn't realized until it was gone that she wanted most of all. The days after Pratt's arrest should have felt like freedom. Instead, Clara moved through them like a woman wading through water, every chore slower, every silence heavier, every glance toward the barn a fresh reminder that the hands who'd mended it no longer belonged to anyone she could name for certain. She told herself it would pass. She told herself that a woman who had buried a husband and fought off a fraud scheme in the same 2 years could certainly survive the absence of a man she'd known less than 2 months. She told herself a great many things that week, and none of them made the ranch feel any less empty. "You've hardly touched your supper," her neighbor Ruth Anders said, arriving unannounced with a basket of bread and the particular nosiness of a woman who'd known Clara since girlhood. "And don't tell me it's the trial wearing on you, Clara Whitmore, because Jacob Pratt's locked up tight and everyone in this valley knows it. This has got a different look to it." "I'm fine, Ruth. You're about as fine as a fence with no posts." Ruth set the bread down and crossed her arms, settling in for exactly the conversation Clara didn't want to have. "Word is, the drifter who was staying here turned out to be some rich rancher from up north. Word is, he lied to you for weeks. And word is, he rode off the same day the truth came out. Word travels entirely too fast in this valley." "It's a small valley, dear. Now is it true?" Clara set down her fork, the fight draining out of her all at once. "It's true." "And you sent him packing?" "I told him to leave. He left." Her voice wavered just slightly, just enough for Ruth's sharp eyes to catch it. "What was I supposed to do?" "Ruth, let him stay after finding out everything he told me was a lie." "I didn't say you were wrong to send him off." Ruth's voice gentled. "I'm only asking if you're certain that's what you wanted." Clara didn't answer because she wasn't certain of anything anymore, and admitting that out loud felt like admitting a defeat she hadn't yet earned the right to name. She threw herself into the ranch instead, the way she'd always thrown herself into work whenever grief threatened to catch up with her. She repaired what needed repairing. She sold what could be sold this time at fair prices, since the whole valley now knew exactly what Jacob Pratt and his conspirators had done to her, and shame had made even the stingiest merchants generous. She rebuilt her small herd, bought 2 new hens, patched the roof before the autumn rains could find their way through. She did everything a strong, capable woman was supposed to do after surviving a terrible ordeal. She did not, however, stop noticing the fence posts William had set, still standing straight and true, weeks after he'd driven them into the ground. She did not stop noticing the porch step that no longer creaked, or the barn door hinge that no longer stuck every small fixed thing in her life, a quiet monument to a man who had lied about everything, except it seemed the honest work of his hands. "Stop it," she muttered to herself one evening, catching her own gaze lingering too long on the corral fence. "Stop thinking about him." The corral fence unhelpfully said nothing back. Tick. 2 weeks after Pratt's arrest, a letter arrived from Judge Marsh requesting Clara's presence at the formal sentencing hearing, a courtesy extended to victims of the fraud, though not a requirement. Clara almost didn't go. Some tired, worn-down part of her wanted nothing more to do with any of it, wanted only to bury the entire ordeal and move forward without ever having to see Jacob Pratt's face again. But another part of her, the part that had stood on her porch with a rifle raised, the part that had demanded her husband's real signature be compared against a forgery, the part that refused to be quiet just because quiet was easier, wanted to look Jacob Pratt in the eye one final time and watch him answer for what he'd done. She went. The courtroom was crowded, half the valley packed in to witness the downfall of a man who had once seemed untouchable. Clara sat near the front, spine straight, chin lifted, refusing to let a single person in that room see anything but composure on her face. Pratt sat at the defendant's table, looking smaller than she remembered, stripped of the confidence that had once made him so insufferable. Cobb sat beside him, pale and shaking. Having already given his full confession in exchange for leniency he clearly no longer believed he deserved. Judge Marsh read the charges in a flat, formal voice: fraud, forgery, conspiracy, attempted theft of property through deception, and the weight of each word seemed to settle heavier on Pratt's shoulders as the list went on. "Mr. Pratt," Marsh said finally, "do you have anything to say before sentencing?" Pratt's jaw tightened. For a moment Clara thought he might finally show some flicker of remorse. Instead he turned and looked directly at her, something cold and unrepentant in his eyes. "I did what any man in my position would do," he said. "She was a widow with land I needed and no husband to stop me from taking it. I saw an opportunity and I took it. I regret nothing except getting caught." A murmur rippled through the courtroom, disgust, evident on more than a few faces. Clara held his gaze without flinching, refusing to give him the satisfaction of seeing her flinch first. "Then let the record show," Marsh said coldly, "that this court finds no mitigating circumstance in the defendant's confession. Jacob Pratt, this court sentences you to 8 years imprisonment for fraud and conspiracy and orders full forfeiture of assets used in furtherance of this scheme, including any claim whatsoever against the Whitmore property." The gavel fell, and something in Clara's chest finally truly loosened. Not joy exactly, but a release long overdue, the last thread of the trap finally cut clean away. Cobb received a lesser sentence, 3 years, in exchange for his testimony, and the courtroom began to empty around her neighbors, offering quiet words of congratulations. Relief, solidarity. Clara accepted them all with a tired smile and slipped out the side door the moment she reasonably could, needing air, needing space, needing a moment away from the weight of so many eyes. She found it in the alley beside the courthouse. She did not find solitude. "Clara." She froze at the sound of his voice. William stood a short distance away, hat in his hands, dressed simply, despite whatever fortune waited for him elsewhere. Not the ragged coat of Samuel Reed, but not the fine clothes of a wealthy rancher either. Something in between. Something that looked, Clara thought, with a pang, she hated herself for feeling like a man who didn't quite know which version of himself he was allowed to be anymore. "What are you doing here? I heard about the sentencing. I wanted to see it through. Make sure justice actually happened after everything." He hesitated. "And I wanted to see you, even if you didn't want to see me." "You were right about that last part." The words came out sharper than she intended, and she watched him absorb the sting of them without flinching the way a man absorbs a blow he believes he deserves. "I know I don't have any right to your time, Clara. I know I forfeited that the moment you found out the truth. I only wanted to say—" He stopped, gathering himself. "I'm glad it's over. I'm glad you're safe, and the ranch is safe, and Pratt is finally answering for what he did to you. Thanks to your lawyer. Harrison would have helped regardless of whatever happened between us. He's not the kind of man who lets fraud like that stand once he's found it." William's hands tightened around the brim of his hat. "But I asked him to look into it before any of it became complicated between you and me. I want you to know that. Whatever else you think of me, that part was never a lie." Clara studied him a long moment, something conflicted and exhausted moving behind her eyes. "Why does it matter to you what I think of you, William? You've got your fortune, your land, your name back. You don't need anything from me anymore." "That's where you're wrong." His voice cracked, slightly raw, in a way she hadn't heard from him before, not even in the worst of their arguments. "I have everything I ever had before I met you, Clara, and none of it means a single thing without you in it. I found that out the hard way in an empty house in rooms too big for one person, surrounded by everything money can buy, and none of what actually matters." "Don't!" Clara's voice shook. "Don't do this here." "Then tell me where. Tell me when. I'll wait as long as it takes, Clara, I swear it. I just can't walk away without you knowing that leaving your ranch was the worst mistake of my entire life. Worse than every lie I told you while I was standing on it. Clara pressed her lips together, hard, fighting against the tears rising in her throat, fighting against the desperate, traitorous part of her chest that wanted nothing more than to close the distance between them and let him hold her the way he had that night by the ravine. "I need time, William." "Take it. However much you need. I mean it. I'm not doing this the way you did things, jumping into something without being honest about what I need first. I need time to figure out if I can trust anything you say after everything." "I understand." He nodded, slow and solemn. "I'll be waiting, Clara. However long it takes." She walked away without looking back, though every step away from him felt heavier than the one before it, and she did not let herself cry until she was well clear of town alone on the trail home, tears finally spilling free in the privacy of open country. Ciao. William did not return to his estate. He took a room instead at the small inn in town, close enough to Clara's ranch that he could feel connected to her without intruding on the space she'd asked for, far enough that he wasn't tempted to ride out and undo the fragile progress of that courthouse conversation with impatience he had no right to indulge. He spent the days that followed doing something he had never once done in his old life. He waited. He wrote letters to Harrison tying up the last details of the Pratt case, ensuring every legal protection possible now stood between Clara and any future scheme anyone might dream up against her land. He arranged quietly, and without her knowledge, for the county recorder's office to flag her property against any future forged claims, a safeguard he paid for himself, expecting nothing in return, needing nothing in return except the knowledge that she would never again face what she'd faced these past months. He did not visit the ranch. He did not send flowers or gifts or any of the grand gestures a rich man might be tempted to throw at a problem he desperately wanted solved. He simply waited and worked and hoped and tried for the first time in his adult life to prove himself worthy of something through patience rather than power. Clara heard about the recorder's office safeguard from Judge Marsh himself 3 weeks after the sentencing, when she stopped by his office to finalize the last of the paperwork, clearing her land title. "You should know," Marsh said, sliding a document across his desk, "that someone's paid to have your property flagged against future fraudulent claims. Costly protection, that. Not the sort of thing most people think to arrange." Clara's stomach tightened. "Who paid for it?" "The paperwork doesn't say. Paid anonymously through Harrison Cole's office." Marsh studied her over his spectacles, something knowing in his expression. "Though I imagine you can guess well enough who arranged it." Clara said nothing, staring down at the document, throat tight with an emotion she couldn't fully name. "He hasn't asked for anything, you know," Marsh added, gentler now. "Not recognition, not gratitude, not even to be told you know it was him. He's simply been quietly making certain nothing like this can ever happen to you again." "That doesn't undo the lying, Judge Marsh." "No," he agreed. "It doesn't. But it's worth something, isn't it? A man showing you who he is through his actions once the lies ran out and he had nothing left to hide behind." Clara left the judge's office with the document folded carefully in her coat and rode home slower than usual, turning William's silent, unclaimed kindness over and over in her mind the entire way. The turning point came on an ordinary afternoon in the least dramatic way imaginable, which was perhaps exactly why it mattered so much. Clara was mending a section of fence near the northern boundary, the same stretch Pratt's men had once cut in the dark, when her tools slipped from her grip and scattered into the tall grass. She knelt to gather them, frustrated, exhausted, her mind circling William, the way it always seemed to circle him now, no matter how hard she tried to keep it elsewhere. She found herself, without quite meaning to, talking out loud to the empty field, the way she'd once talked to Thomas's ghost across an empty kitchen table. "I don't know what to do," she admitted to no one. "I miss him. I hate that I miss him, but I do, and I don't know if that makes me a fool, or if it makes me someone who's finally allowed to want something for herself instead of just surviving." The wind offered no answer, but something in saying the words aloud settled a decision inside her that had been forming for weeks without her fully realizing it. She did not love William Hawthorne, whoever exactly that man was. She loved Samuel Reed, the man who'd mended her fences, who'd sat at her table without complaint, who'd held her steady after the wagon accident, who'd sworn to her by the ravine's edge that she would not lose this place whatever it took. The lie had been about a name and a fortune. It had never, she realized now, been about who he actually was in the small, quiet, unwitnessed moments that made up the truth of a person. She rode into town the very next morning. She found him at the inn, in the middle of writing another letter, hunched over a small desk, with ink-stained fingers and the exhausted look of a man who hadn't slept properly in weeks. He looked up when she knocked, and the pen fell from his hand entirely. "Clara, I know about the recorder's office," she said before she could lose her nerve. "I know you paid for it anonymously. I know you've been sitting in this room for 3 weeks instead of going home to your mansion, waiting for me to decide something without ever once pushing me to decide it faster. I told you I'd wait as long as it took." "I know." Her voice trembled slightly. "That's the problem, William. You've spent 3 weeks proving to me through everything you didn't say, and everything you quietly did, instead exactly the kind of man you are when nobody's watching. And I don't know how to keep being angry at a man who keeps doing that." William stood slowly, hardly daring to hope. "Clara, I'm not saying everything's forgiven," she said quickly, cutting him off before hope could run too far ahead of her. "I'm not saying the lying didn't hurt, because it did more than I've let myself admit to anyone but an empty field this morning. But I came here because I needed you to know I don't think I was ever angry at Samuel Reed. I think I was only ever angry that Samuel Reed wasn't real. He's more real than you know," William said softly. "Everything he did, everything he felt for you, that was never the lie, Clara. The only lie was the name on top of it." "Then tell me something true right now," Clara said, chin lifting, some of her old fierceness returning to her voice. "No coat, no false name, no secrets. If I asked you to come back to the ranch today, would you come as William Hawthorne, rich rancher with 12,000 acres? Or would you come back as the man who fixed my porch step and sat beside me by the ravine and swore I wouldn't lose everything whatever it took?" William crossed the small room in 3 steps and took her hands in his, steady and certain, in a way he had not been steady or certain about anything since the day he'd overheard Evelyn's laughter years before. "I would come back as both," he said. "Because they were never 2 different men, Clara. William Hawthorne is simply the name on paper for the man who learned on your ranch what it actually means to be loved for who he is instead of what he owns. I can't give that name up. It's mine, whether I like all the baggage attached to it or not. But I can promise you, it will never again stand between us as a secret. Everything I am, everything I have, it's yours to see clearly, from this day forward, if you'll let me back into your life." Clara's eyes filled, and this time she didn't fight the tears. "That's a lot of promises, William." "I intend to keep every single one." "You'll have to earn that trust back slowly. I'm not simply going to hand it over because you said pretty words in a rented room." "I know." He smiled, small and hopeful. "I'll earn it as slowly as you need. I've got nowhere else I'd rather be, Clara, and nothing else I'd rather spend my time doing." She studied him a long moment, weighing 3 months of lies against 3 weeks of quiet, unclaimed devotion, weighing her own fierce independence against the terrifying vulnerability of wanting someone again after believing she never would. Then, for the first time since the courier's letter had shattered everything in her yard, Clara Whitmore closed the distance between them herself. The kiss was nothing like the almost kiss that had been interrupted weeks before. It was slower, surer, carrying the full weight of everything they'd survived to reach this exact moment: the forged signature, the cut fence, the courtroom, the empty ranch, 3 weeks of silence that had somehow said more than any declaration could have. When they finally broke apart, William rested his forehead against hers, breathing unsteady, eyes bright. "Does this mean I'm forgiven?" "It means you're on your way," Clara said, though a small, genuine smile finally broke through the careful composure she'd worn for weeks. "Don't get ahead of yourself, William Hawthorne." "I wouldn't dream of it." You would. You're exactly the kind of man who'd dream of it. But she was laughing now, soft and real, and William thought he had never heard a more beautiful sound in his entire life. Not in any concert hall his fortune had ever purchased him a seat in. He returned to the ranch that same afternoon, not as Samuel Reed, not hiding behind a false name and a borrowed coat, but as himself fully and completely for the first time since he'd first ridden through her gate months before. It felt strange at first walking those familiar fences as William Hawthorne instead of Samuel Reed. Clara caught him more than once staring at his own hands as he worked as though relearning what it meant to build something honestly, without a mask, standing between himself and the work. You look like you don't know what to do with yourself. Clara observed, watching him hesitate over a fence post he'd mended a dozen times before under a different name. I don't entirely, he admitted. I spent 3 months being Samuel Reed so completely I nearly forgot what it felt like to be William Hawthorne standing on land that wasn't mine, working beside a woman who knows exactly who I am. Does it feel worse? No. He looked up at her, something settled and certain in his expression now. It feels like the first honest thing I've done in years. Clara crossed the yard and took the hammer gently from his hands, setting it aside, drawing him instead into a slow, unhurried embrace that neither of them rushed to end. Then get used to it, she murmured against his chest, because I don't intend to let you hide behind anything ever again. I don't intend to give you reason to. But even as the two of them settled slowly into this new, honest chapter, a shadow remained at the edge of everything. One William had not yet found the courage to raise one that had been sitting in the back of his mind since the moment Clara first stepped into his arms in that rented room above the inn. He had spent his entire adult life running from people who wanted him for his fortune, and now, standing in the yard of the woman he loved, fully known and fully forgiven, he found himself facing a fear far larger than any he'd carried before. Not the fear that Clara wanted his money. The fear that returning fully to his old life, with all its expectations and obligations and glittering empty rooms, might one day pull him away from the only place he had ever truly felt at home. He did not say this to Clara that evening. As they sat together on the porch step, he had once repaired under a false name, watching the sun drop low over land that finally truly belonged to her free and clear. But the thought sat heavy in his chest all the same, waiting for the moment he would no longer be able to keep it silent. The letter arrived 8 days later, carried by a writer Clara didn't recognize, and the moment William saw the seal on the envelope, his whole body went rigid. "What is it?" Clara asked, watching his face change. "My board of directors." William's jaw tightened as he read. "They want me back in the capital. There's a decision pending on a rail contract worth more than this entire valley, and they say it can't wait any longer for my signature. Then you should go." "Clara, I mean it." She said it steadily, though something in her chest pulled tight at the words. "You have a life there, William. Responsibilities. People who depend on you making decisions I can't even pretend to understand. I'm not going to be the reason you neglect all of it." "You're not neglect. You're the first thing in years that's felt like it mattered more than a contract. That's a beautiful thing to say." Clara reached up and touched his jaw, gentle but searching. "But I need to know something, and I need you to answer honestly, because we promised each other no more half-truths. If I asked you to choose right now between that life and this ranch, could you actually choose it? Or would some part of you always wonder what you gave up?" William's silence lasted a beat too long, and Clara felt it land in her stomach like a stone. "I don't know," he admitted, finally hating the words even as he said them. "I've spent my whole adult life being William Hawthorne of Hawthorne Cattle Company. I don't know who I am if I'm not that man anymore. I know who I want to be when I'm standing beside you. I'm just not certain I know how to become him permanently." Clara nodded slowly, some old familiar guardedness creeping back into her expression. "Then go," she said quietly. "Go handle your contract. Take whatever time you need to figure out the answer to that question. But William, I won't spend my life waiting on a man who isn't certain he wants to be here. I did enough waiting. I did enough wondering. I need you sure, or I need you gone." "Clara, that's not fair. It's the only thing I've been in this whole ordeal," she said, voice cracking slightly. "Fair. I've been fair to you since the day you showed up with holes in your boots and lies in your mouth. I need you to be just as fair to me now." William looked at her a long moment, torn between two lives he no longer knew how to reconcile. "I'll go," he said finally, "but I'll come back with an answer. I swear it." "You've sworn things to me before. I know." His voice was raw. "This time, I intend to prove it, instead of just saying it." He left the next morning, and Clara watched him ride away for the second time in 2 months, though this departure carried a different weight entirely than the first. The first time she had sent him away in fury, certain she never wanted to see him again. This time, she stood on her porch with her arms wrapped around herself, terrified that the pull of his old life might prove stronger than whatever he'd found on her ranch, and even more terrified of how much that possibility hurt. "Don't you dare fall apart over him," she muttered to herself, wiping angrily at her eyes. "You built this ranch back with your own 2 hands. You don't need a rich man's decision to tell you who you are." She believed the words as she said them. She was not entirely certain she believed them by nightfall. The capital swallowed William whole the moment he arrived. His estate greeted him exactly as he'd left it 3 months earlier. Vast, polished, and utterly silent, every room echoing with an emptiness he'd once mistaken for peace, and now recognized simply as loneliness wearing an expensive coat. His board of directors greeted him with barely restrained impatience. A dozen men in fine suits gathered around a table too large for genuine conversation, each one eager to discuss the rail contract, as though the fate of the territory hung on William signing his name by week's end. "Mr. Hawthorne, we've held this decision as long as we responsibly can," said Aldous Grimm, the eldest board member, tapping the contract with an impatient finger. "The railroad needs an answer. Sign the agreement, and Hawthorne Cattle Company doubles its shipping capacity within the year. Refuse, and our competitors will happily take the terms instead." William stared down at the contract, at the neat rows of numbers, representing more money than Clara's entire ranch would see in a decade, and felt nothing but a strange, hollow indifference. "Give me a day to review it fully." "A day, Mr. Hawthorne, we've already given you 3 months of your absence to account for. The board has been patient. The board has been compensated handsomely for its patience," William said, sharper than he intended, and the room fell into an uncomfortable silence. "One day. I'll have my answer by tomorrow evening." He left the boardroom before anyone could argue further, and walked the halls of his own mansion like a stranger touring someone else's life. Running his hand along furniture he barely remembered choosing, staring at portraits of ancestors whose approval he had spent years chasing without ever quite earning. He found himself eventually in the small study where he'd once received the letter that ended his engagement to Evelyn Carr. He sat in the same chair, stared at the same window, and for the first time in 2 years, allowed himself to fully remember that night, the laughter drifting down the hallway, the casual cruelty of a woman who saw a title before she saw a man. He thought of Clara's rifle raised at her gate, suspicious and fierce, and how she had lowered it not because of anything he owned, but because of the simple, honest exhaustion in a stranger's face. He thought of her voice at the supper table, refusing to let him eat alone. He thought of her hands, steady on his, while she tied a bandage to her own bleeding wrist, more worried about him seeing her hurt than about the hurt itself. By morning, William Hawthorne had his answer, and it had nothing to do with a railroad contract. He walked into the boardroom the next evening and set the unsigned contract down on the table without ceremony. "I'm declining the deal!" Uproar broke out immediately, a dozen voices rising at once in protest, disbelief, barely restrained fury at the sheer financial recklessness of the decision. "Mr. Hawthorne, this is madness. The competitors will absorb this contract within the week if we don't. 3 months you vanished, and now you return only to throw away the single greatest opportunity this company has seen in a decade." William raised a hand, and something in his expression finally silenced the room. Not the practiced authority of a wealthy man used to obedience, but something steadier, more certain than they had ever seen from him before. I built this company to secure a life I thought I wanted, he said. Land cattle contracts more money than any single family could spend in 3 generations, and for years I believed that accumulation was the same thing as purpose. I was wrong. Mr. Hawthorne, I'm not finished. His voice carried steady and unshaken. I found something these past 3 months that this contract cannot buy me, gentlemen, no matter how many zeros you attach to it. I found a place where I mattered as a man, not as a signature on a ledger. And I will not sacrifice one more day of that life, chasing a fortune I already have more of than I know what to do with. Grimm stared at him incredulous. You're prepared to walk away from Hawthorne Cattle Company for a woman. I'm prepared to walk away from spending every waking hour of my life proving my worth to people who only ever valued the worth of my accounts. William met each man's gaze in turn, steady and unflinching. I'm not abandoning the company, Mr. Grimm. I'm restructuring my role in it. I'll retain ownership. I'll review major decisions. But I will not spend the rest of my life a prisoner to boardrooms and contracts when I've finally found a reason to live outside of them. He left the meeting with half the board furious and the other half stunned into silence, and he did not look back once as he walked out of the building that had once been the entire architecture of his identity. For the first time since Evelyn's laughter had chased him out of his own engagement, William Hawthorne felt entirely, completely certain of who he was. He was a man who chose Clara Whitmore, not despite everything he owned, because everything he owned meant nothing beside her. The ride back to the valley took 3 days, and William spent every hour of it turning over exactly how he intended to prove his answer, instead of simply speaking it, because Clara had made herself painfully clear she was done with promises that lived only in words. He arrived at her gate at dusk on the 3rd day, and this time he did not wear the ragged coat of Samuel Reed, nor the fine tailored clothes of William Hawthorne at his most powerful. He wore simple, honest clothes, working clothes, the kind a man wears when he intends to stay and build something with his own 2 hands, rather than a man passing through on his way to somewhere grander. Clara stepped onto the porch when she heard the horse, and for a long moment neither of them said anything at all. The weight of the last week stretched taut between them. You came back, she said finally. I told you I would. You told me a lot of things, William. Her arms crossed guarded, despite the way her eyes betrayed how badly she'd hoped for exactly this moment. What did you decide? William dismounted slowly, and instead of answering with words, he reached into his coat and withdrew a folded document, holding it out to her. Clara took it confused and unfolded it carefully. It was a deed not to her ranch, but to a parcel of land directly adjoining it, 1,200 acres that had once belonged to Jacob Pratt, seized during his sentencing, and sold at auction to settle the county's claims against him. I bought it, William said quietly. Not as Hawthorne Cattle Company, as myself. I intend to build a house here, Clara. Not a mansion, not 12,000 acres. Just enough land to build something real right beside yours if you'll have me. Clara's hands trembled around the deed. William, I turned down the rail contract. He continued, the words spilling out now that he'd finally started. I restructured my role at the company. I'll still oversee it, still make the decisions that matter, but I'm not spending my life in that boardroom anymore, chasing approval from men who only ever valued my signature. I choose this valley, Clara. I choose this land. I choose you. Not as a test this time. Not as some experiment to soothe old wounds. As the only decision I've ever made that felt completely, entirely mine. Clara stared at the deed in her hands, then up at him, tears rising fast and unstoppable. You gave up the contract for land next to mine. I'd have given up considerably more than a contract. You're serious. I have never been more serious about anything in my life. Clara let out a shaky, disbelieving laugh, the deed crinkling in her tightening grip. You're insufferable, you know that. You disappear for a week to go make some enormous life decision, and you come back not with flowers, not with pretty words, but with a deed and a plan to build a house. Would you have preferred flowers? No. Her voice broke soft and full. No, I think I'd rather have the house. William crossed the yard and pulled her into his arms, And this time there was no interruption, no courier riding up the drive to shatter the moment, no forged signature waiting to unravel everything they'd built. There was only the two of them, standing on land that was finally truly safe, holding on to each other, like two people who had both fought their way through fire to reach this exact place. The following weeks passed in a blur of building and laughter, and the particular hard-won joy of two people constructing something entirely their own. William hired local men from the valley to help raise the frame of his new house, insisting on paying them fair wages, insisting on working alongside them himself, despite protests that a man of his standing shouldn't be swinging a hammer in the dirt. "I've swung a hammer before," he told the crew, grinning at their skeptical faces. "Ask Mrs. Whitmore. I fixed half her fences before any of you knew my real name." "That true?" One of the younger men asked Clara, who had ridden over with lunch for the crew. "Every word," Clara said, laughing. "Though I'd have appreciated knowing his real name a little sooner." "I'm making up for lost time," William said, kissing her cheek in front of the entire crew, who hollered and whistled with good-natured teasing. Clara swatted at him, blushing, though her smile gave away exactly how little she minded. The valley, once so quick to whisper about a struggling widow and a mysterious drifter, now buzzed with an entirely different kind of gossip. The astonishing tale of the richest rancher in the territory, who'd fallen for a widow's kindness before he ever revealed his fortune. Who'd given up a railroad contract worth a small kingdom to build a modest house beside her land instead. Ruth Anders predictably made certain to hear every detail firsthand. "So it's true then," she said, arriving with her usual basket and her usual nosiness, watching the house frame rise in the distance. "The rich rancher's really staying. He's really staying. And you forgave him just like that after everything." "Not just like that," Clara said, watching William laugh with the work crew across the field. Something warm and settled in her chest as she watched him. "It took weeks. It took him proving himself in 100 small ways before I ever let myself trust the big ones. But yes, Ruth, I forgave him." "Well." Ruth set the basket down, studying Clara with something like genuine happiness. "I suppose even a fool like me can admit when a story turns out better than the gossip made it sound." "Whoa." The house took 2 months to complete, modest, by William's old standards, but grander than anything the valley had seen outside of Pratt's former estate. Sturdy, honest built, with the same careful hands that had once mended Clara's fences under a false name. The day William moved in, he stood in the empty front room and turned to Clara with something nervous flickering behind his eyes for the first time in weeks. "I have one more thing to ask you," he said. "And I need you to know this isn't a test. This isn't an experiment. This is simply the truest thing I have ever wanted to ask anyone in my entire life." He reached into his coat and withdrew a small velvet box, opening it to reveal a simple gold ring, far less ostentatious than anything a man of his fortune might have been expected to offer. "I chose this one myself," he said, voice unsteady. "Not the finest stone money could buy. Just something honest. Something that matches the man I want to be beside you, rather than the man my accounts say I could afford to be." Clara's breath caught tears already rising. "Clara Whitmore," William said, dropping to one knee in the unfinished front room of the house he'd built with his own hands. "I came to your gate with nothing, and you gave me everything that ever actually mattered. A seat at your table, your trust, your fierce and stubborn heart. I don't have a clever speech for this. I only have the truth. I love you. Not the ranch you saved, not the fortune I still carry, but you, your strength, your honesty, the way you refused to fold, even when the whole world seemed determined to break you. Will you marry me?" Clara stared down at him, at the ring, at the man who had lied his way into her life, and then spent months proving with nothing but honest, patient work that the lie had never touched the truth underneath it. "Yes," she said, laughing through her tears. "Yes, William Hawthorne. 1,000 times yes." He rose and swept her into his arms, spinning her once before setting her down and kissing her slow and certain, in the unfinished front room of the first home either of them had ever built entirely on their own terms. "Come," They married that autumn beneath the same old oak tree that had shaded Clara's original homestead for 3 generations, the same tree beneath which Thomas Whitmore had once proposed to her years before fever took him too soon. Clara had worried in the quiet moments before the ceremony whether marrying beneath that particular tree might feel like a betrayal of Thomas's memory. But standing there in her simple ivory dress, watching William wait for her with unguarded joy written across every line of his face, she understood something she hadn't expected to understand. Thomas had loved her fiercely in his own quiet way, and had wanted nothing more than her happiness even after he was gone. Marrying William beneath that tree wasn't a betrayal of that love. It was a continuation of it, proof that a heart capable of loving once fully could love again just as fully without diminishing what came before. The whole valley turned out for the wedding. Half of them the same neighbors who had once whispered doubts about a widow choosing a penniless drifter, now cheering as loudly as anyone when Judge Marsh himself, standing in as officiant, pronounced them husband and wife. "You may kiss your bride," Marsh said, and William did not wait to be told twice. Years later, the valley told the story differently than the truth had actually unfolded, the way valleys always do, smoothing rough edges into something simpler, more romantic, easier to repeat over supper tables to children, too young to understand the fear and fraud and fury that had actually shaped it. They said the richest man in the territory had fallen in love with a poor widow's kindness. They said he'd tested her with nothing, and she'd passed without ever knowing she was being tested, and love had bloomed simple and pure between 2 honest hearts. They left out the forged signature. They left out Jacob Pratt's cold calculation, Elias Cobb's desperate confession the weeks Clara had spent furious and grieving and uncertain whether she could ever trust the man who'd lied to her so thoroughly. They left out the hardest parts, because hard parts rarely survive retelling. But Clara and William remembered every bit of it, and neither of them ever pretended the path here had been easy. They kept the memory alive deliberately, honestly, the way they kept everything else between them, without polish, without pretense, exactly as it had actually happened. Clara's original 200 acres and William's new 1,200 grew over the years into one of the most respected ranches in the territory. Not the largest, not the wealthiest, but the one every hand in the valley spoke of with genuine respect, because William Hawthorne worked that land himself every single day, hammer and rope and honest sweat, exactly as he had the very first week he'd arrived at Clara's gate, with holes in his boots and a lie on his tongue. He never stopped proving in small daily ways that the lie had only ever been about a name. Everything underneath it had always been true. No. On their 5th anniversary, William found Clara sitting on the same porch step he had repaired all those years before, watching their 2 children chase each other across the yard in the fading evening light, and he sat down beside her, the way he had 100 times since that very first supper she'd insisted he share at her table. "Do you ever think about it?" he asked. "The man you thought I was that first night, all the time?" Clara leaned her head against his shoulder, watching their children's laughter carry across the yard. "I think about the drifter with the cracked boots more than I think about the rich rancher, if I'm honest. He's the one who earned all of this. The rancher just finally caught up to him." William laughed softly, pulling her closer. "I used to believe those were 2 different men, that I had to choose between them. And now I know they were always the same man. I just needed you to help me see it." Clara looked up at him, at the years etched gently into his face, now the lines that came not from wealth or worry, but from honest work and hard-won contentment. "No one eats alone at my table," she said softly, echoing the words that had started everything all those years ago, when a stranger stood hollow-eyed at her gate and she chose against every ounce of caution to see the man instead of the poverty. "No one," William agreed, drawing her hand to his lips. "Not ever again. Not as long as I live." And as the sun dropped low over land that had once been stolen through fraud and forged signatures now standing whole and honest, beneath a family built on nothing but truth, one thing remained certain, beyond any doubt, beyond any lie, beyond any fortune a man could ever hope to hold. Clara Whitmore had never loved William Hawthorne for what he owned. She had loved him first and loved him best, when he had absolutely nothing at all. And that love forged in honesty rather than gold would outlast every acre, every dollar, and every name he ever carried for the rest of their days.